Hello, I'm Dr. Vance Ginn, Senior Economic Fellow at the South Carolina Policy Council. Today there was an excellent discussion about new tax reforms that are being discussed in South Carolina. Among the hearing was a number of discussions about the rates and everything else, and I had some thoughts about this that the South Carolina Policy Council has put in a recent paper that I authored that I wanted to share with you today. So I hope that you'll listen in and we can get right to it. So look, I've been working at every levels of government, whether it be in Washington as chief economist for the Office of Management and Budget, to issues on state and local policy at more than 20 think tanks across the country. I'm also founder and president of Ginn Economic Consulting, and I worked in the first Trump administration in the White House Office and Budget, which was a great time learning about what's happening in the federal budget, but also seeing how it influences states and everything else. And what I wanted to start off with is, let's start with a simple truth. The people in South Carolina are working hard, but they're getting squeezed. Inflation remains high, real average weekly earnings or even hourly earnings are flat or declining in many places, and the cost of many necessities continue to rise. Families feel it, small businesses feel it, and many others do as well. This is something that's hitting across the political spectrum, and it's why I think South Carolina needs to move to lower their income taxes. Now here's the good news though. South Carolina is in a relatively stronger position compared to many other states. The state's GDP is growing, incomes are rising, and there's a budget surplus of about $1.6 billion is in reserve funds that are out there. That's a great problem to have overall, right? But it also means that this is a time to get fiscal policy right, which are taxes and spending. So what's the issue? The bill that's being discussed and that was discussed today during Ways and Means hearing in the House is House Bill 4216. The tax reform bill under consideration has the right goals in mind, flattening the tax code and setting the state up for future tax rate reductions to zero. Elimination, that's so important here. There are 8 states without a personal income tax across the United States, with Florida, Texas, Tennessee being 3 of them. But you also have about 14 other states that are moving to either flat income tax or have one already. So nearly half the states across the country either have a flat income tax or no income tax. South Carolina should be one of those as well, to make sure to stay competitive, where right now, according to the Tax Foundation, which Manish Bhaat from the Tax Foundation spoke today and did an excellent job in testimony, talked about how, according to the Tax Foundation's state competitive tax index, they rank South Carolina 33rd. So the bottom of the pack overall compared to where it should be if there were some key reforms like those being discussed. But the current vision, unfortunately, takes a wrong turn within this bill. The plan reduces the current system with 3.99%, or replaces the current system with a 3.99% flat tax on adjusted gross income and removes common deductions. As a result, almost 60% of filers, especially low and middle income families, would actually see a large and disproportionate tax increase on them compared to the higher income earners. And about 40% of South Carolinians do not pay income taxes today. So when you're broadening the base, then you're going to have some people are paying in, but it's a matter of what magnitude. And under the current proposal for the 3.99% bill, with the changes in deduction and everything else, there's a much larger increase on the burden on those with lower incomes. So it's a tough sell overall. Critics argue that this reform can be regressive, but the reality is that higher income earners already pay the majority of income taxes, both in South Carolina and even nationally. A flat tax does not remove progressivity. It streamlines the process and ensures that everyone contributes, that there's some skin in the game, if you will, within paying for government spending. The best form of fairness in the tax code is simplicity and opportunity, not a tangled web of carve-outs and redistribution. If the state wants growth and upward mobility, it must empower people to earn more and keep more of what they earn. A flatter system does that while still ensuring the largest tax contributions come from those with the highest incomes, if that's what some want to do. It's because the bill changes how income is calculated and what deductions are allowed that causes some of these problems. It's a narrow system with a broader base, but without offering enough protection for families at the bottom or middle income earners. I've examined 2 scenarios provided by the South Carolina Department of Revenue. In both, too many South Carolinians, especially those earning $100,000, end up paying much more in taxes. That's not a flat tax that works for everyone. As Manish Bhaat, who I mentioned earlier, the Tax Foundation points out in a recent article, he says, quote, "The less generous deduction paired with the rate applied to all income leaves the state's lowest income residents with higher taxes, a non-neutral and unsound tax policy," end quote. There's a better way. So consider the following. Remove the marriage penalty by ensuring joint filers are not taxed more heavily than two single filers. Tax code fairness requires that couples are treated equitably, whether married or not. Additionally, South Carolina should cap the earned income tax credit, the EITC, instead of having too much of a liability overall, to prevent ballooning liabilities and to better target assistance without distorting incentives to work or earn more. Keep the flat tax goal and ultimately to get to zero. But maybe, just maybe, start with a slightly higher tax rate, say 4.75%, something that keeps you below 5%, so that way you're comparable or competitive with states like Georgia, which are already in that vicinity. You really want to make sure that you're competitive in this this national playing field for tax competition. The ultimate objective should be to get to the flat rate as low as possible, as quickly as possible, to achieve zero income taxes. This minimizes distortions, strengthens growth, and ensures that every tax cut moves to stay closer to full elimination. You should also apply this to the federal AGI with simple, broad deductions. That keeps the code easy to file, protects more families, and keeps the state on the path to zero income taxes. So don't overcomplicate it. The federal tax code is already a headache. South Carolina should simplify rather than creating a whole new South Carolina income adjustment deduction. And when it comes to cutting rates over time, consider surplus triggers. Revenue triggers are based on guesses of what the revenue is going to be, projections of what will happen. But surpluses, that's real money over collected from taxpayers. You limit spending, and the over additional amount is the surplus that comes in from revenue. And by the way, the legislature doesn't control revenue. That's out of the dynamic economy. So even the models that are put in place by the Department of Revenue are static models, not based on incentive effects and dynamic factors that go into this. And so that also can bring up other issues that don't allow us to see the full effects of what these types of policies could be. And I also think that having that surplus in place, it helps to force the direction towards spending restraint, which is needed more in South Carolina. I'll mention that in just a minute. But it also allows for that new revenue to go into surpluses and therefore cut taxes. So there's somewhat of a revenue trigger, but it's really capturing spending and revenue. If you take your eyes off of spending restraint, then you run into the Kansas problem of overspending in the last decade, or even a couple decades ago in South Carolina, where there was too much spending. Even as there were some pro-growth tax reforms that were made, the overspending outpaced the increases in revenue over time, running deficits, and states can't have deficits, right? And which is fortunate that that's the case. And so whenever that happened, they decided to raise taxes instead of restraining spending. And that became the Kansas problem and everything else that, I don't want to see South Carolina and other states get involved in that. That's why you should pass sustainable budgets. I think it's also really important, like Americans for Tax Reform has talked about as well. And as South Carolina Policy Council has continued to push for the responsible South Carolina budget. Patrick Gleason, speaking of American tax reform, put it well in a recent Forbes article, open quote, "If revenue triggers are met, taxpayers are left waiting for relief that may never come," end quote. That's the flaw, or a flaw, with revenue triggers. They're based on hopes, not results. If South Carolina used just 25% of its budget surpluses annually, and looking at historical averages of revenue growth, population and inflation, and you limit the spending in general fund, population growth plus inflation, and you look at the effects of how you could have the flat rate go down to zero and just keep using the surplus each period. Because as revenue grows, even whenever you use some of that revenue to buy down, or the surplus, but to buy down the income taxes, what you still see is more growth because of dynamic factors. And also that new revenue is a new base, so it builds off of that, okay? If South Carolina had just used 25% of its budget surplus annually, the state could eliminate personal income taxes by 2032, and even the corporate income tax by 2033. That's not theory, that's math. Here's what nearby states are doing. You have North Carolina is cutting its flat rate to 2.49%. They use revenue triggers, but North Carolina has also done a good job of sustainable budgeting in many cases. Their growth in spending just for state and all funds has been about half of what it is in South Carolina. So they've been able to rein in their spending recently, which allows for them to have more of a surplus trigger than a revenue trigger without cutting the budget, just slowing down the growth. And that way you can still fund essential roles for government that the legislature determines. Tennessee and Florida have no income tax at all, including my home state of Texas. Georgia's lowering rates gradually with spending controls in place. So South Carolina is competing with them in other states and even countries now for talent, investment, and growth. But the state is starting behind. And House Bill 4216 in its current form will be unlikely to get it as far ahead as what it should be. So the real key to all this is spending restraint. As Milton Friedman said, quote, "The real problem is government spending," end quote. Since 2013, South Carolina general fund budget has more than doubled. That's far faster than what taxpayers can afford, which is just 56% when adjusted for population growth plus inflation, which is a good measure of the average taxpayer's ability to pay for government spending. Had the state followed this responsible budget approach since 2013, there would be $15 billion more that could be used for tax relief, meaning that they overspent by $15 billion, or even $3 billion in the current budget, or about $150 million in the upcoming budget. So this is more money that could be in taxpayers' pockets, where you have increases in productive capacity for investment and savings and other things that really grow the economy and provide more jobs. South Carolina, so in closing, South Carolina has a chance to lead, to build a tax system that's flat, fair, and on road to zero. But that won't happen if states raise taxes on working families and bets future cuts on optimistic revenue forecasts. South Carolina should keep it simple. It should tie tax cuts to actual surpluses. It should spend responsibly. And above all, South Carolina should let people prosper. So I thank you for this. I thank you for the opportunity to be in South Carolina today. It's always a pleasure. And I'm grateful for the work the South Carolina Policy Council is doing and others into making sure that South Carolina can be as prosperous as possible. With the best tax reform and sustainable budgeting, responsible budgeting, this can be a path forward. Thank you.